What's up? Welcome back. I am Josh, the driving instructor, and if you are training to do your ADI Part 3 or standards check, this is going to be a very exciting video for you. Maybe you'll be as excited as I was as well. These are 10 of the most common reasons for people failing their ADI Part 3 in the local area. Now, these points may differ slightly around the country because, as I say, they are not national standards, they are just within a smaller team. However, if one point did come across very clearly, it's that these points do not change year on year. If anything, they are very, very consistent, and they stay. If anything, they are very, very consistent. So let's have a look at some of these points, and we're going to try and discuss them in a bit more detail. I'm going to reflect on them of how they affected me on my trainings to become a driving instructor and complete my ADI Part 3 as well. Now, the first point that actually really rang true, that was made before anything else, was just talking about driving test nerves. And this applies both to the standard driving test and the ADI Part 3 and any other test as well. And that's that actually when we go for our driving test or whatever we're going, whatever test it may be, we are often very anxious and very nervous. And we often put down any failures to the driving test down to nerves. And sometimes absolutely this can be true. But as was pointed out, why are we feeling so nervous and anxious? And generally that's down to the fact that we have not prepared for the test properly. And I believe this is where the saying comes in, fail to prepare and you've already prepared to fail. Because if you haven't done your homework and you don't have a complete understanding of the picture, you are going to be very nervous, like I was on my ADI Part 3. Looking back now, I know I could have prepared for that test far better than I actually did. Luckily, I had just prepared enough to carry me through and pass first time. But that could have easily gone the other way. Now, these 10 reasons are not in any particular order. They are just a list of 10 common reasons for failing your ADI Part 3. And the first one links to what we've already said, and that's that ADIs and PDIs are not preparing properly for the test, or they're not seeking the correct amount of training. And when we talk about training, we often talk about getting an audit registered driving instructor. And basically an audit registered driving instructor is someone that has taken an exam and has shown that they are perfectly capable of training other driving instructors. However, you can also be trained by a standard driving instructor. The problem you've got is, although there are a lot of really good driving instructors out there that can train PDIs to become driving instructors, there can also be some out there that are not as good. And if that wasn't the case, I wouldn't hear quite so many horror stories. Whereas if you go with an audit registered driving instructor, you are more or less guaranteed to get the correct training that you are going to need for your ADI Part 3. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, what else can we actually do to help us prepare for our ADI Part 3? Now, don't be surprised if a lot of these overlap and actually join, just like everything else in driving. Our driving skills all overlap. Our competencies with our driving test and our ADI Part 3 actually overlap, and exactly the same for these. These reasons for failing actually overlap as well. And a really important thing we can do to help us prepare for the ADI Part 3 is actually understand the marking sheet, but we'll touch more on that later. And this was something the examiner actually mentioned because they see it a lot as well. And that's that PDIs get their pink badge and end up using it to earn a living, when it's really not designed for that, and you can't actually do that and train at the same time. So try not lose focus and pile so many lessons in that you're not actually to get any training yourself. Now, the second big reason for people failing their ADI Part 3 is that they're actually not aware of the national standards for training driving instructors and riders alike. And again, I can reflect on this because I didn't even know this document existed until I was very close to the end of my training in my ADI Part 3. And it was only at that point that the trainer insisted that I read the document, as it's a really important part of preparing for my ADI Part 3. And if you're wondering yourself what this document actually is, well, the title of the document actually says it for you. And it says, who is this unit for? This document is for people who train learner drivers and riders. What I'm saying is, if you are training to become a driving instructor, this document is really important to read. And if you don't believe me, believe the examiner. On top of that, it is completely free. And when you're paying between £35 upwards per lesson of training, and you've got a completely free document there, seems like a no-brainer to me. If you're struggling to find it, either type that into Google, national standards, otherwise click on the link in the description below. Ho, ho, ho. So number 3, not researching and gaining an understanding of the ADI 26 Part 3 CS1 marking sheet. And that's very long-winded, but basically the marking sheet for your ADI Part 3. Again, that's in the link below if you'd like to have a look. And as I mentioned before, this is an absolutely huge part of your ADI Part 3 training. And it's honestly not that difficult. It just takes more continuous, consistent time of continuously looking at it after each lesson that you have, just maybe focusing on one of those competencies to try and improve it and work out what it's about. It is not a document that you can pick up just before your ADI Part 3 and start looking at and make sure you think, oh, I need to tick that one, and that one. It just doesn't work like that. And on the positive side as well, if you end up getting 3 marks in one competency, that's going to end up probably giving you 2 to 3 marks in another competency as well. You also need to understand what each competency actually means. If you don't know what it's asking for, you're not going to be able to complete it. There are so many things here based around the marking sheet. I could do a whole video just on that. In fact, I think I'm going to. My next video is going to be all about the marking sheet. And number 4 is delivering a pre-planned lesson that actually has no bearing on the student's development. And essentially this is when you go for your ADI Part 3, but you've pre-planned the lesson, you've run through it with the students, you know exactly what's going to happen. You've set it up like dominoes, push the first one, and down they all go. Unfortunately, it doesn't end up happening. Instead, you push the first domino, it falls over, and all the others just stay standing. Why? Because when you make a lesson that rigid, it ends up like stone, which means when something happens in a lesson, for instance, your lesson's on roundabouts, and the first 2 junctions your student goes to, turning left, they completely flop it by hitting into the curb. But because you've made that lesson so rigid, and you've planned everything that you must do, you try and ignore that and move straight onto the roundabouts. This is not going to give you a positive outcome on your ADI Part 3. Whereas if you hadn't pre-planned the lesson to such a degree that it became completely rigid, you would have recognized that mistake that the student made and adjusted for it. Moral to the story is try not set a rigid plan, don't do a pre-planned lesson, and try and keep the lesson at the right tone for the student. Far easier said than done, but there we go. Number 5 is when the ADI or PDI tries to read a script for what to say at the beginning of the lesson, the middle of the lesson, and the end of the lesson. Quite similar to 4, as in pre-planning. And as I mentioned before, this makes the lesson very rigid, like stone, and it makes it very difficult to adapt anything. Why? Because if you think about it, if you've decided on what you're going to say at the beginning, you've decided on what you're going to say in the middle, and then you've decided on what you're going to say at the end, this makes it really difficult to try and change anything in the middle. Because if you change what you say in the middle when the student makes a big mistake, then that's going to change what you're going to say at the end. But then if you try and avoid that, the student's not going to make progress, or it's not at the right tone because you haven't adapted the lesson for the student's mistakes, which now gives you a negative outcome. Can you see the reason why it can be very difficult to try and script the lesson? Something else that's really important to touch on here is prior to obviously COVID, the lessons were 60 minutes long, and the exam actually pointed out that people felt that they needed to give a really long and spiely brief before the lesson, and then a long spiely debrief at the end. You know, you're talking 10 to 15 minutes, and they didn't actually want to see that. So since COVID, they've actually reduced the lessons down to the 45-minute mark, and they've said that they want to see approximately 40 minutes of wheel turning time and 5 minutes of, stopping time. And they don't want to see really long briefs at the beginning or at the end. They're looking about 2 to 3 minutes, which means there's no longer going to be any need to try and pre-script the lesson, and instead you can focus more on wheel turning time. Number 6 is very similar to 4 and 5, and it's staging the lesson. Staging the lesson and not identifying when the student is actually doing better or worse, and just continuing with the lesson plan. So it's pretty much exactly the same as 4 and 5, but it's showing you how important and how often this is actually happening for all 3 different cases to be 10 of the most common reasons for failing your ADI Part 3. And again, this can often happen because if you stage the lesson, it means you've done the lesson repeatedly with the student already. And if you've already done the lesson with the student, chances are they may very well be half decent at that lesson now. Perhaps it's turning left at roundabouts. Chances are they've developed their skills for that lesson already, which means you come to do it a 3rd or 4th time, on your driving test, and now the student can already do it. But rather than recognizing that and moving on to the next skill, because you've pre-planned it and you want to stick to the plan and make it very rigid, you don't adapt the lesson. And if you're not adapting the lesson, the student's not learning anything, you're not providing value for money, and then you're going to fail your ADI Part 3. Number 7, this is a really interesting one. It makes perfect sense, but I just never thought about it before. And that's bringing a full license holder. And it was actually warned against bringing a full license holder unless you had prior training with it. And people are actually failing that ADI Part 3 because suddenly they bring a full license holder and they end up pitching the lesson all wrong. And the reason they pitch it all wrong is because they've done all their training and all their coaching with learner drivers. And suddenly they go for the ADI Part 3 and they're trying to teach full license holder, but they're pitching it all wrong. Essentially, you are warned against taking a full license holder unless you have had prior training of teaching a full license holder. Otherwise, you're going to find it very difficult to try and tone the lesson to them and show progress if you have no knowledge of how to do that. Number 8, again, we've heard some similarities to this already, and I hope it's starting to wake you up and realize that this is actually a big thing that's causing a lot of issues with people failing their ADI Part 3. And that's bringing a pupil with very little development and not adapting the lesson. And don't take this too literally, but the way I think of it, the better the student, the worse instructor you are. And basically your job is to teach them something. So if your student's doing something really well in a lesson and you're not helping them, that doesn't mean you're doing a good job. That means you need to adapt the lesson. As a teacher, your lesson does stay very rigid generally. And if your students are doing really well, that reflects really well on you as a teacher. But as a driving instructor, if your student's doing really well and you're continuing with that, you're not doing a good job because that student's not going to be making any further progress if there's no challenge. And if they're not making progress, you're not providing them value for money, which again is going to reflect very badly on your ADI Part 3. So moral to the story, you need to continuously help your student challenge themselves. And if your student makes a mistake on your ADI Part 3, that's a really good thing, providing you deal with it correctly. I'm repeating this just because I did struggle with this so much, trying to get my head around the fact that if a student makes a mistake, that's not bad. That's just my job to help them fix that. That's giving me something to do. It's a good thing. If the student doesn't make a mistake, I'm not toning that lesson correctly for the student. Number 9, again, quite similar. Not adapting the lesson if the pupil actually achieves the goals set or at least change them. And again, this can link back, especially if you try and pre-plan the lesson or have a script or reenact a lesson, because if you've already done a lesson with the student 3 or 4 times, chances are they may be very good at the lesson. They may have gained the skills they need for turning left, which is going to leave very little room for showing progress. And if you don't then adapt the learning goal with the student and come up with a new goal to help them show some more progress, this is going to negatively impact your Part 3. Number 10, now this is a really big one, especially now since we've had COVID, and that is not planning the area or the route. It's also not maximizing your time during the lesson, and it's driving long distances to get to the location. And all of these are really important because obviously they've reduced the amount of lesson time for your ADI Part 3 from 60 minutes down to 45 minutes. So they do not want long briefs at the beginning or end. They do not want a huge amount of you driving to a particular area because that's wasting the lesson for the student. And you cannot afford to be getting lost in random areas because you haven't planned the route correctly. And such things as roadworks are just not going to wash as an excuse. Because after all, if someone's paying you between 30 and 40 pounds an hour for a driving lesson, you cannot turn around to them and say, oh, there's roadworks, I don't know where we're going, but you still have to pay, because that's not how driving lessons work. That's not fair. So it's your job to plan better. And the reason for this, since COVID, it's so important now more than ever, is because of the lack of tests and the popularity of becoming a driving instructor means it's very difficult to get a driving test. And why is it so important since COVID? Well, because it's so difficult to get a driving test for your ADI Part 3. People are having to come from far and wide to cities and towns that they've never driven in just to sit a test. I've also met a fair few people that live on islands such as the Scottish Highlands that have a driving test centre on the island, but you cannot sit an ADI Part 3 test on the island, which means they're having to fly or get a boat to the mainland in order to sit a test, which I feel really bad about, because I would hate to have to go to a city or town that I have no idea about to suddenly teach a driving lesson. So the point they made here is it's so important to make sure that you do plan and prepare for that area that you're planning to teach in. You need to have a really good understanding of the training areas and not just one training area, because if there's going to be a day that there's roadworks, you can trust it'll be on your ADI Part 3, which means you need multiple training areas. And it comes back to the whole being nervous. Imagine how you'll feel if suddenly on your ADI Part 3, the road that you actually needed to go down is closed because you haven't prepared properly, you haven't checked for an alternative route. How nervous and anxious are you now going to feel? Moral is, make sure you have some really clear route plans available. Okay, that is all 10 tips. If this has helped you with your ADI Part 3 or your standards check, please don't forget to like and subscribe to the video, because I promise you there are going to be some more very exciting and helpful videos coming your way very soon. I am Josh, your driving instructor, and I am out.